Hi Craftee, Rose here. So this tutorial will show you how to turn this square into a wrap. Alright, remember we have a tutorial for this square, so you check it out, make a square, and then we go on to make to extend it into a wrap. And we're going to need two colors of yarn in worsted weight or aran weight. And we also need a 4.5 millimeter hook. Of course, you also need a scissors and a darning needle to weave in your tails. Alright, let's begin. We're going to start in any of the corners. So into any of the corner chain 3 spaces, you can join. So we will start with our main color and join the yarn. Chain 2, 2 double crochets into the same space. Double crochet into the next puff stitch. And into the next as well. Double crochet into the chain 1 space. So across the row we're going to make double crochet stitches into each of the stitches, double crochet in puff stitch, double crochet in chain 1 space. So repeat this across up to the next chain 3 corner. Into our chain 3 space, 2 double crochets, chain 3, 2 double crochets. We'll continue to make double crochet into each of the stitches and chain 1 spaces. We have 2 puff stitches here, so double crochets and double crochets. Okay, across the row we'll make double crochet stitches just as we did on this part. Double crochet in chain 1, double crochet into puff stitch. Into the last chain 3 space, we're going to make 3 double crochets. Turn, or chain 2, turn, or turn, chain 2. Chain 2, row 2, skip the first stitch, which is this last stitch right here, and we will do a double crochet decrease into the next 2 stitches. So we've joined 2 stitches to become 1. So really what we did here was was to decrease across 3 rows. Across 3 stitches, because this chain 2 is not being counted as it's not 1 full stitch. So we've decreased and excuse me. Then into the next stitches we make double crochet into each stitch across. Into the chain 3 space, 2 double crochets, chain 3, 2 double crochets, and make another double crochet stitch into each stitch across, and we will decrease across the last 3 stitches. Alright, so I've worked all the way on the row, all the way across. with double crochet stitches, and I have 3 stitches left, which is what we began with chain 2 and 2 double crochets. So we're going to decrease across these 3 stitches. So double crochet, decrease, DC2 together in next stitch and in top of chain 2, in the top of chain 2 right there. All right, turn chain 2 or chain 2 and turn. Row 3. We're going to skip the first stitch, which is this decrease right here, and we will make a DC 2 together in next 2 stitches. So we're decreasing. So how this works is at every corner, every point, on these points we decrease because we are making a wrap and we need these edges to be straight. So decrease, skip the first stitch and decrease, double crochet, decrease. Chain 1, skip the next stitch, double crochet into the next stitch. Chain 1, skip the next stitch, double crochet into the next stitch. Repeat this across the row up to the chain 3 point. So continue to chain 1, skip 1 stitch, double crochet into the next stitch. Alright, we've worked up to the row. Chain 1, skip the last stitch into the chain 3 space, 2 double crochets, excuse me, chain 3, 2 double crochets, chain 1, skip the next stitch, double crochets, chain 1, skip next stitch and double crochet. We'll repeat this across to the last 3 rows. Okay, I actually have 4 stitches left. Okay. Anyways, so chain 1, skip 1 stitch, so we have 1, 2, 3 left. Now this looks like a stitch, but it isn't. All you have to do is just turn and see. This is the chain 2 and then the decrease that we did at the beginning of row 2. So we have 3 stitches left after skipping this last one. So decrease in the next stitch and skip the next stitch and into the last stitch. We'll make another DC, half DC rather, and decrease. That's it. Chain 2, turn, turn, and chain 2. Row 4. Okay, on row 4, after the chain 2, skip the first stitch into the chain 1 space and into the first stitch, DC 2 together. Double crochet into the chain 1, chain 1, skip, double crochet into the chain 1 space, chain 1, skip, double crochet into the chain 1 space. So we're going to repeat this across the row up to the chain 3 space. Into the chain 3 space, 2 double crochets, chain 3, 2 double crochets. Now chain 1, skip next stitch. Pardon, don't chain 1. We're gonna like repeat what we have here. So double crochet into the next stitch. Now chain 1, skip the next stitch, double crochet into chain 1 space. Repeat this across the row, and we will decrease across the last 3 stitches. Alright, we have 3 stitches left. So after the last double crochet, do not chain 1. We have the DC, chain 1, and the decrease we did on previous row. So we're going to decrease from the chain 1 and into the top of the next stitch. Chain 2, turn. Skip the first stitch and decrease in the next stitch and in chain 1. Now this row 5, is all double crochet stitches. So we're going to make double crochet into the stitch and double crochet into the chain 1 space. At the end of the row we have chain 1 and double crochet and the decrease. So we are going to skip, double crochet 2 together into the chain 1, skip the next stitch and into the last stitch, chain 2, turn, or turn and chain 2, decrease, skip first stitch, double crochet 2 together in the next stitch, in next 2 stitches, double crochet into each stitch across, in the chain 3 space 2 double crochet, chain 3, 2 double crochet, and continue to make double crochet stitches down the row, and we will decrease at the end of the row in the last 3 stitches. At the end of the row we have 3 stitches left, so double crochet, decrease, skip the next stitch and into the last stitch do a double crochet, decrease. We're going to finish off with our second color. Chain 2, turn. Row 7 is puff stitches, but we're going to decrease first. So skip the first stitch into the next 2 stitches, okay, like as though we wanted to do a half double crochet, but we're not going to complete it, and then we'll go into the next stitch. Chain 1, skip 1 stitch, puff, 2 HDC puff stitch, chain 1, skip 1 stitch, 2 HDC puff. So we're going to repeat this across the row. So after the last puff stitch, chain 1, skip the last stitch and into the chain 3 space. We'll make a puff, chain 3 and puff. Chain 1, skip the next stitch, puff stitch into the next, chain 1, skip 1 stitch, puff stitch into the next stitch. We'll repeat this across the row and we will decrease in the last 3 stitches. After the last puff stitch, chain 1 and skip 1 stitch. We have 1, 2, 3 left. So we're going to decrease across these 3 stitches. So yarn over, going to stitch as though you wanted to make a half double crochet, skip the next stitch, and in the last stitch yarn over, going to stitch and pull through all loops, chain 2, turn. So row 8 is a repetition of row 7 with a slight difference, of course, at the top here. Okay, so chain 2, this is our first stitch here, and this is chain 1, and this is the next stitch. So we're decreasing across this 1, 1, 2, and 3, this puff stitch. Alright, so into the chain 1 and into the top of the puff stitch. Chain 1, skip the chain 1, in the puff stitch make another puff stitch. Chain 1, skip chain 1, in the puff stitch make another puff stitch. Alright, we're going to repeat this across the row. Okay, after the last stitch, into the chain 3 space, after the last puff stitch, no chain 1, then into the chain 3 space, puff stitch, chain 3, puff stitch. Do not chain 1 and puff stitch into the next puff stitch. Chain 1, skip chain 1, puff stitch into the next puff stitch. We're going to repeat this down the row, and we will decrease in the last 3 stitches. Alright, I have the last stitches left. So after the last puff stitch, chain 1 and skip the chain 1. So we have one last chain 1 here, one puff stitch, one chain 1, and then the last stitch. So into the puff stitch we go, don't finish off, skip the chain 1, and into the last stitch we go. Alright, I'm going to drop this and pick up my main color and finish that off. I'm going to cut the color blue, chain 2, sorry, alright, so in the first stitch I'm going to skip the first stitch and into the chain 1 space and into the next puff stitch. We'll make a decrease, double crochet 2 together. I am carrying this tail because I want to save myself the hassle of weaving in a lot of tails by the time we're done here. Okay, we'll continue to make a double crochet. So this row now will be a repetition of this row 1. From here on, we're just going to repeat 6 rows with the main color and 2 rows with the contrast color. Double crochet into the chain 1, double crochet in the puff stitch. Two double crochets, chain 3, 2 double crochets into the chain 3 space. Continue to make double crochet into the puff stitches, double crochet into the next puff stitch, double crochet into chain 1 space. So we continue to make double crochet stitches across the row, and we will decrease in the last 2 rows. Okay, we're supposed to decrease across 3 stitches, not 2. My mistake. Alright, so here we are into the puff stitch. Skip the chain 1 space and into the last stitch. Chain 2, turn. Okay, so what we're going to do now is to repeat rows 2 to 8 because we've done row 1 already. So repeat rows 2 to 8, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So these rows will be repeated. Okay, so once we complete up to row 16, we're going to repeat these 8 rows of stitches. So we'll repeat these 3 more times until we have 5 rows of puff stitches. So this is 1 and this is 2, so we need to do it 3 more times to have the number that is required. And after that we will make the pockets. So go ahead and repeat these 8 rows. So once we have our 5 rows of puff stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, on the 5th row we will not the 5th row from this, for the 5 rows of puff stitches. Okay, chain 2, turn, and now we're going to make the pocket, but we'll be at the beginning we'll be decreasing across 2 stitches only, not 3 stitches like we did for the other part of the body. So double crochet into the chain 1 space, that's after the chain 2, double crochet, then double crochet into the top of the puff stitch. This row is all double crochet stitches, so I'm going to be counting as row 1 this time, not a continuation of the body, just for the pocket. And into the chain 3, 2 double crochets, chain 2, turn, or turn and chain 2, row 2. Skip the first stitch and double crochet into the next stitch. Now at no point does chain 2 count as a stitch. Chain 2 doesn't count as a stitch, so we are decreasing here. And do double crochet stitches across, and we will decrease in the last 2 stitches. In our last 2 stitches, double crochet, decrease. Okay, I have 3 here. Chain 2, turn, or turn and chain 2, row 3. Skip the first stitch and double crochet into the next. We're doing a decrease here, so instead of doing a DC2 together, I just skip the first stitch and chain 1, skip 1 stitch, double crochet into the next stitch, chain 1, skip 1 stitch, double crochet into the next stitch. So repeat this across the row. We'll increase in the last stitch, skip, double crochet, chain 1, skip, double crochet. Alright, okay, chain 1, skip 1, and then double crochet. So we have our last stitch here. We're going to chain 1 and double crochet into the last stitch. We're not making 2 double crochets here because this chain 1 counts as 1 double crochet, so we have automatically increased with the chain 1 and the double crochet. So chain 2, turn or turn, and chain 2, double crochet into the chain 1 space, which is because we're skipping the first one, right? Chain 1, skip stitch, double crochet into chain 1 space, chain 1, skip stitch, double crochet into chain 1 space. So repeat this across the row, and we will decrease in the last 2 stitches. We have our last stitch here after the last chain 1, and we have the DC. This chain 1 is for the DC, so we will make a decrease in the chain 1 and the last stitch. Chain 2, turn and turn, and chain 2. This row, next 2 rows will all be double crochet stitches. So we're going to decrease, skip the first stitch, and double crochet into the chain 1 space, double crochet into each of the stitches across in the stitches and in the chain 1 spaces. In the last stitch, we're going to make 2 double crochet stitches. Two double crochets into the last stitch. Chain 2, turn, a turn, and chain 2. Skip the first stitch, double crochet into the next stitch and into each of the stitches across. We will decrease in the last 2 stitches. And decrease in the last 2 stitches. This time I'm going to finish with the contrast color. Chain 2, turn, a turn, and chain 2. Okay, skip the first stitch, half double crochet into the next stitch, chain 1, skip 1 stitch, puff stitch into the next stitch, chain 1, skip 1 stitch, puff stitch into the next stitch. Repeat this across the row. Okay, after the last puff stitch, I'll chain 1 and make a half double crochet into the last stitch. So that's 2 stitches done. Chain 2, turn. Half double crochet in the chain 1 space. Puff stitch into the puff stitch. Chain 1. Puff stitch into the next stitch. Chain 1. And continue repeating this across the row. We decrease in the last 2 stitches. Okay, we have our chain 1 and half double crochet stitches left. We're going to make a half double crochet into the first stitch. That is after the last puff stitch. Do not chain 1, which is this because we're decreasing. And I'm going to pick up the main color can snip this off because I will no longer be needing it. And chain 2, turn, and chain 2. Row 9. We'll skip the first stitch, which is this half double crochet right here, and do a double crochet into the puff stitch. And double crochet into the chain 1 space, and double crochet into the puff stitch. Repeat this across the row. And 2 double crochets into the last stitch, which is the half double crochet from the previous row. Chain 2, turn, and chain 2. From this point, we're just going to repeat rows 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's all we need to repeat for the remaining part of the pocket. So once we're done with this part of the pocket, which is going to be like this, all right? So yeah, it's going to be like this. And soon on this part here. But before we do any sewing, we're going to trim the edge here. Since we still have a working yarn, I don't want to snip the yarn when I could just as well trim the edge here. So we're going to chain 1 and turn. We're going to do single crochet stitches in reverse. It's also called the crab stitch. So into each stitch row, we will make single crochets. So you have to be patient here because, you know, it could get a little tasking, having to twist your hand to make the single crochets backward. So chain 1 into each stitch row, single crochet. So that's 2 stitches we're making on each stitch row, the chain 1 and the single crochet. Chain 1, single crochet. Nice and slow. Chain 1, single crochet. So I'm going to stop here because I don't have the second half of the wrap. So so 2 ways you can do this. If you didn't want to make the trimming yet, you can, once you complete the pocket here, you snip the yarn and we'll crochet the second half of the wrap. Or you can work your trimming up to the center of the square. Okay, I haven't done into the chain 3 yet, just the first row. That's where I'm stopping. But I'm not going to snip this yarn. I've separated the ball of yarn so that I can use part of it for the second side. So for the second half, we're just going to repeat everything we've done on here except the pockets, because the pockets will have to begin from here. Because when we begin, okay, when we start this project, we're going to start this way with the right side facing, because from here we began from this point here. So for this, we will begin from here and go just the same thing we've done all the way till we'll have 5 rows of puff stitches. Excuse me. And then we will make the pocket from this end in back and forth rows, and we will close it up. Once we complete the second half of the wrap, we're going to make pocket number 2. So we want to join from the chain 3 space on the puff stitch row. Join the main color, chain 2, 2 double crochets into the same space, then double crochet into each stitch, into the puff stitch and into the chain 1 spaces across the row. At the end of the row we will decrease. And we will decrease across these 2 stitches the chain 1 and the HDC decrease from the previous row. So on the pocket area, we're decreasing across 2 stitches, not 3. On the body, we decrease across 3 stitches, but for the pocket, we decrease across 2 stitches. So chain 2, turn and chain 2. Skip the first stitch, double crochet into the next stitch, double crochet into each stitch across the row, and we will decrease in the last 2 stitches. And at the end of the row on row 2, we will decrease across the 2 stitches minus the chain 2. That chain 2 doesn't count as a stitch. Chain 2, turn and chain 2. In the first stitch, double crochet, chain 1. So this is our increase, double crochet and chain 1. Into the next stitch, double crochet, chain 1, skip 1 stitch. In the next stitch, double crochet, chain 1, skip 1 stitch. We're going to repeat this across the row and we'll decrease in the last 2 stitches. So our last stitch is the chain 1 before the decrease. So we have 1, 2, 3. So chain 1, skip 1 stitch and decrease, double crochet 2 together. Chain 2, turn and chain 2. Row 4, skip the first stitch, double crochet into the next stitch. Chain 1, double crochet into chain 1 space. Chain 1, double crochet into chain 1 space. Repeat this across the row. We will decrease in the last 2 stitches at the end of the row. Alright, we have double crochet, we have our DC. Okay, chain 1, skip the DC, now into the chain 1 space from the beginning of the row, from the previous, beginning of previous row. We will decrease in chain 1 space and the stitch. Chain 2, turn and chain 2. Row 5. Into the first stitch we make 2 double crochets, and double crochet into the chain 1 space, double crochet into the double crochet. We repeat this across the row, double crochet into each stitch and chain 1 space. We will decrease in the last 2 stitches. Decrease in the chain 1 space and the last stitch. Double crochet, decrease. Chain 2, turn and chain 2. Row 6. Skip the first stitch, double crochet into the next stitch, and into each stitch across the row you'll decrease in the last 2 stitches. End the row with double crochet, decrease. This time we're gonna, on the last loop, we're going to change to our CC contrast color. So that's the last loop there. Excuse me. Chain 2, turn, or turn and chain 2. Into the first stitch we'll make a half double crochet and chain 1. So that is our increase. Into the next stitch we'll make our puff stitch. Chain 1, skip 1 stitch, puff stitch into the next. Chain 1, skip 1 stitch, puff stitch into the next stitch. We're going to repeat this across the row and we will decrease in the last 2 stitches. Alright, last puff stitch, chain 1, skip 1 stitch and half double crochet, decrease in the last 2 stitches. Chain 2, turn, or turn and chain 2. Row 8. Skip the first stitch, half double crochet in the chain 1. Puff stitch into the puff stitch. Chain 1, skip chain 1, puff stitch into the puff stitch. We're going to repeat this across the row and we will decrease in the last 2 stitches, which are the chain 1 and the half double crochet stitch. Alright, we have our last stitches here, chain 1 and half double crochet. So I'm going to do a HDC2 together in the chain 1 and in the half double crochet. I'm going to drop this and pick up the main color, chain 2, turn, turn and chain 2. You can snip this off because we won't be needing it anymore. Row 9. Double crochet, double crochet. Excuse me. And in the puff stitch as well, another double crochet. Because we're increasing on this row. At the beginning of this row, we increase. So we have 2 double crochets and double crochet in the chain 1, double crochet, and in the puff stitch, double crochet. Repeat some double crochet stitches across the row. And we'll decrease in the last puff stitch and half double crochet. Chain 2, turn and chain 2. Okay, so what we're going to do for the next 5 rows is to repeat rows 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. Okay, so repeat this 5 rows, rows 2 to 6, and we're done with pocket number 2. Once we complete the second pocket, we're going to trim. Right? So you want to start trimming from the excuse me. You want to start trimming from this part of pocket 1. Okay, so on this end, so it goes, okay, when it's folded it's like this. So we start trimming from this part down, but because I already trimmed, I trimmed all the way to the middle here, so I'm just going to carry on from here. But if you're just starting to trim, you want to start from the first row and the first stitch. You join the yarn and start working chain 1 and start working backward. Chain 1, single crochet into the stitch row, chain 1, single crochet into the stitch row. So that's what we're going to do all the way. I'm going to continue from here. Alright, so that's my last single crochet. I'll chain 1, and into the next stitch row, single crochet, chain 1, next stitch row, single crochet. So this is known as the crab stitch. You just continue that across the row. Chain 1, single crochet into the next stitch row. And the last stitch will be a single crochet. So this is the second pocket. So I have trimmed from one end of the pocket, from pocket 1 to pocket 2. I'm going to slip this with leaving a tail to join this part here. This one will be used for this. Now I'm going to trim the opposite end. This is actually the stitch, not into the chain space, into the first stitch on the row. Chain 1, I'm going to make another single crochet in there. Chain 1 and into the next stitch row, single crochet, repeat this across into each stitch row, single crochet, chain 1, single crochet, chain 1. When you get to the center of the square, which is the chain 3 where the body began, chain 1 and single crochet into the next stitch row, and we repeat that crab stitch across. And I'm ending the last stitch on the last row, which is the puff stitch row. We'll slip the yarn and weaving tails, and we will sew the pocket. Okay, the right side of the wrap is the right side of the the squares. Okay, so we want to sew our pocket like this, but we will sew this part first. This is pocket 1, so I'm going to go backward first. The puff stitch row will just lie underneath. I'm going to sew from the inside out. Now I'm going to turn it back. It should be stationed right here under the puff stitch row. This is one stitch, this is the second stitch. So on the second stitch row under the puff stitch, that's where we're going to sew the pocket. And the last stitch, all done. Snip this yarn, weave in the tails. And we will repeat the same thing for pocket number 2. Okay, so this is the front of the right side of our wrap. So for the pocket number 2, we will start from here first. I have my yarn here, so I'm just going to sew it, and when I'm done, I'll turn it back out and remember to station your puff stitches just right underneath the pocket and sew it across as well. Once you complete your wrap, it is highly recommended that you block it. When you block it, it's going to stretch it out and give it a better shape. All the scrunched parts will stretch out. And you have the option to also make a closure. So all we have to do is make a chain of 75, which I have done here, 75. So I have 75 chains here. I'm going to close up this part with beads. This is an optional step, okay? And if you wanted to have a closure without the beads, you can do that as well. Just going to tie it, close it up. Once that is done, I'm going to pass it through the space between the puff stitches. Okay, that one seems to be a bit smaller, so I'm just going to go into the next space there. And it's all done. You have your tie here. Close it up whenever you want. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining me on this tutorial. I hope you get to make one. I hope you find it exciting and adventurous as I did. And don't forget to tag Craftee when you make this. I love to see your version and your beautiful colors. Thank you once again for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like Craftee channel. And I'll see you in the next tutorial. God bless you. Bye.